Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the third in a series of lectures on Homer's excellent epic, the Odyssey. Today, we're going to be covering books 5 to 8. We'll start with book 5, where we first encounter Odysseus on Calypso's island. So, as you'll recall, in the first 4 books, we see only Telemachus, Odysseus's son, and the plight back on Ithaca. The entrance of Odysseus is delayed essentially until book 5. And our first view of Odysseus comes when Calypso goes to take him Hermes' message that Zeus has ordered for Calypso to let him go. So Odysseus has been trapped on Calypso's island for 7 years. And Calypso, a goddess, has obviously much more powerful than Odysseus, has not allowed him to leave. Our first glimpse of Odysseus is him sitting by the seashore, looking out over the water and weeping. In book 1, Athena had said that Odysseus was longing to see even the smoke rising from his own country, and he wanted to die. So here in our first view of Odysseus, this is confirmed, and we have this sense of his profound longing, his helplessness, his passivity. So in this, on Calypso's island, Odysseus is passive and thus unlike his true self. And we can parallel this with the figures of Telemachus and Laertes. So in book 1, we first see Telemachus, Odysseus's son, who is also passive, and Athena has to arrive in the disguise of mentor to guide him along to be more active and assert his place in the kingdom. So too, at the end of the epic, we see Odysseus's father, also passive, living in the rural countryside, not being the regal, active figure that he should be as well. So in each case, each of the generations in Odysseus's line, we see the characters needing to be guided back to their true identity. I think this painting is a good visual representation of the Odysseus that we see on Calypso's island. It's by Arnold Bocklin, 19th century Swiss painter. It's entitled Odysseus and Calypso. We can see in the figure on the right, Calypso seated with a lyre. We should note that in the epic, Penelope, by contrast, weaves, which is this domestic activity. We can see the barren nature of the existence. It's just this rocky island. It doesn't seem as idyllic as it's portrayed in the epic. So I think we're getting kind of, let's say, the spiritual essence of what's happening on the island rather than the mere physical description. And on the left, we see Odysseus, his back turned, facing out over the water, and his painted in this dark silhouette such that he almost blends with the rocky landscape and appears to some extent less than human. So Hermes has brought this message to Calypso that Zeus is ordering her to let him go. It's Odysseus's fate to return home. Calypso grudgingly passes this message on to Odysseus, but she also adds that Odysseus has the option, if he prefers, to stay rather than return to Penelope. And she poses it in terms as well of, why would you want to return to Penelope? How could she be more beautiful than me? You could stay here, be immortal, and stay with a beautiful goddess. So Odysseus's response has to be carefully crafted. Calypso has framed it in terms of why would you prefer Penelope to me? His response has to be framed in such a way that she does not feel insulted in any way, that he does prefer to return to Penelope. Obviously, again, as a goddess, she can do quite unpleasant things to him. So we see Odysseus's prudence and his gift in rhetorical speech, his carefully crafted speech that's attentive to the needs of the audience and the perspective of the audience. So his response here, "Ah, great goddess," worldly Odysseus answered, "don't be angry with me, please. All that you say is true. How well I know. Look at my wise Penelope. She falls far short of you, your beauty, stature. She is mortal after all, and you never age or die. Nevertheless, I pine all my days to travel home and see the dawn of my return." So in that response, the emphasis is less on him preferring Penelope to her than his longing to return home. It's crafted in such a way that she can take it as not necessarily being a slight against her. The other element of this is that Odysseus understands what it means to be human. Calypso has offered immortality, but he rejects it. So Greek mythology, Greek stories are littered with examples of heroes who seek immortality. Not just Greek, if we think even back to the Epic of Gilgamesh as well. There's this, seems to be in primordial urge to try to transcend the human limits of the human condition, the mortality of the human condition. And this drives, in a, as I said, a primordial sense, many of the original stories that humans made is how can we overcome these limits that we have of having a finite time on this earth. In Greek mythology, there seemed to be this sense that we seek that, but if you were to get it or in seeking it leads to disaster. So in all myths, the hero seeking immortality, it always ends disastrously. It's seen as a hubristic attempt to transcend human limits. By contrast, Odysseus flatly rejects the offer. And in this, even though this is the beginning of his journey as presented to us in the Odyssey, it's in a way he's already attained what is the ultimate end and accomplishment of Achilles in the Iliad. So in the story of the Iliad, it's Achilles' great grief that drives him to anger against Hector is a failure to accept the loss of Patroclus, that humans are mortal, humans are finite. By the end, in book 24, he's able to, in his encounter with Priam, express an acceptance that we have limited lives and that we have to accept that and kind of bear with an almost stoic strength the suffering that the gods dish out on humans. So Odysseus, right from the beginning, has this desire to return home, or desire to return to his full humanity and selfhood. And in this sense, it's an acknowledgement that Odysseus is not Odysseus without Ithaca, without his community, without his wife Penelope, without Telemachus, without those, let's say, context of human relationships. Now, I want to contrast this with Ulysses. So Ulysses is the Latin name for Odysseus, and Ulysses, or let's say the tradition of interpreting the story of Odysseus that has developed since. So for instance, in Dante's medieval epic, the Divine Comedy, so written in the early years of 1300s. Ulysses is shown in the eighth circle of hell, so pretty deep. There's 9 circles among false counselors, so liars, deceitful figures. So we should note that Dante had not read Homer in the original, but had received negative and positive interpretations of the story via later Roman authors. The negative side of Ulysses is portrayed in Book 2 of Virgil's Aeneid, where he's labeled as dreadful and the deviser of crimes in book 2 of the Aeneid. And as I said, these portrayals, including most powerfully Virgil's, came to dominate the later tradition and the Middle Ages that Dante was a product of. On the positive side of that interpretation, there were some Stoics and other Roman authors that saw Ulysses, or the Latin name for Odysseus, as demonstrating heroic fortitude in the face of adversity, as well as a quest for wisdom, as a quest to go out and try to find truths about existence. So Horace, for instance, praised Ulysses for his discernment and endurance. Cicero interprets the story of the sirens that we'll talk about in a later lecture, as he sees the sirens as givers of knowledge, and Ulysses wanted to hear that call and found that to be more praiseworthy and more desirable than a return home. So in Cicero's words, it is knowledge that the sirens offer, and it was no marvel if a lover of wisdom held this dearer than his home. So Cicero is basically calling Ulysses here a lover of wisdom, a philosopher, and that he desires wisdom more than a return home. So Dante combines the negative and positive strains, and he invents a new story. His Ulysses departs from Circe directly for a new quest, pulled not by the desire for home and family, but by the lure of adventure. So to quote Dante, the longing, this is Ulysses speaking to Virgil and Dante in the underworld. The longing I had to gain experience of the world and of the vices and the worth of men. So we could contrast this notion of that Dante presents of a Ulysses whose directionality is outward and away from home, with Homer's Odysseus, where the pull is inward and it's to home. So Dante's Ulysses is presented as this transgressor. Pride incites him to seek knowledge beyond the limits that are set for man. And in Dante, Ulysses is a parallel to Adam. So Adam and Eve in biblical Genesis text, who had chosen knowledge over living within the limits of given to man by God. So a similar but somewhat different presentation by Tennyson in the famous poem Ulysses. So this is a few centuries later, 1833. So while Dante saw the heroic striving as a transgression that led to perdition, led to Ulysses being in hell, Tennyson celebrates in this poem entitled Ulysses the heroic striving of the figure of Ulysses. So he's building on the same story that Dante presented, but interprets it positively. So here in Tennyson's poem, he's older, back on Ithaca, but boldly longing for new adventures. And these are the the final lines of Tennyson's poem, sometimes quoted in high school graduations and that type of thing. And those lines go, "We are not now the strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." So that, especially that final line, people have perhaps come across that in the past, seen as a positive striving in the modern age, seen as a positive striving by Tennyson. But it's important to note that both Dante and Tennyson, so Dante and Tennyson both present Ulysses as striving outward for new adventures, not as wanting to go home. So Dante and Tennyson both present that. Dante presents it as something not to be praised, as something that leads to perdition. Tennyson presents it as praiseworthy, but both of them are not the Odysseus we see in Homer. So in Homer, Odysseus accepts the human condition and wishes for a return home where he can fully live within its limits. At this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about the gods in Homer, both in the Iliad and the Odyssey, since it's such a crucial dynamic that's working in the epics. So mortality is the crucial distinction between humans and gods. So the gods are the athanatoi. So thanatos is death in Greek, and the a prefix is equivalent to un in English, so it's a privative. So athanatoi means undying ones or deathless ones. So they cannot die. That's their defining feature, is that they are undying. Humans, on the other hand, are thanatoi. They're dying. They must die. So that's our defining feature. And this is an essential contrast, the gods and mortals. The gods provide a contrast that, in this contrast, it sharpens and highlights the meaning and the uniqueness of mortal existence. So the other thing I want to point out here is that the gods are not metaphorical. So some critics have tried to explain the involvement of these gods. They try to make Homer's story, let's say, a more naturalistic story and try to say, well, these gods are just metaphors. Homer's not assuming that there's some sort of supernatural deity out there. These gods are just metaphors for human emotions. So they'll take an example from the beginning of the Iliad where it says that Athena stopped Achilles from killing Agamemnon in the first book. So we could say that here that this is just a metaphor for Achilles' wisdom stopping his impulse or his anger from killing Agamemnon. And perhaps in that case, that could be seen as an interpretation of that incident, but there are many instances where that explanation does not work. The gods are taking active roles in the plot. Aphrodite physically removes Paris from the battlefield. Just one of many examples in book 3 of the Iliad. So you can't explain that metaphorically. It actually changes the plot. It's actually, we need to understand that as physically happening. So as we said, they offer a contrast with human affairs to highlight the meaning of human existence. So to understand humans, we need to understand the gods a little bit, and we need to distinguish it from modern notions that we might have of what a god is. So often within the monotheistic traditions that the modern world is heir to, we might think of God as moral, as consistently good, merciful, just, and if this is not the case in the Greek world. So the gods are not necessarily moral, nor are the gods omniscient. They don't know everything. They know a great deal, but they don't know everything. So there are examples there in the Odyssey where Poseidon had been away to Ethiopia receiving sacrifices and hadn't seen that Odysseus was doing X, Y, or Z. And when he comes back, he sees that and responds. They are not omnipotent. They're not all powerful. They're very powerful, but they're not all powerful. They're not transcendent. So, and again, in the traditions following the Hebrew Bible, God is separate from the cosmos and creates the cosmos. Here, the gods evolve out of they generate as part of the evolution of the cosmos. They're not loving, with the exception of sometimes they will have personal favorites. Athena has Odysseus as a favorite and seems to care for him, but they do not necessarily care for humans generally. What are they? They seem to have originally been forces of nature. They seem to have been ways of naming forces of nature that then through as stories about these gods attached different qualities to them, the figures evolved and began to be associated with those qualities, but their role as natural forces endures. Aphrodite is very much sexual passion. Ares is war, that type of thing. They are conceived of as anthropomorphic. They share human passions and form. And just another way in which their presentation can be contrasted with that of mortals is that when they are shown in battle, especially in the Iliad, it comes off as comedic. And part of that's related to the fact that they can't die. So there's no consequences on the line. So when they are in battle, Aphrodite, for instance, in the Iliad, she's kind of wounded in the battle. She goes back to Olympus, and it's kind of comedic, poor Aphrodite there, and they're kind of teasing her. And at the beginning of the Iliad, there are these scenes of comic bickering between Zeus and Hera, and it comes off as this almost comedic domestic bickering as opposed to what's presented as life and death struggles of the Greeks and Trojans, or between Achilles and Agamemnon, quarrels that have some consequence. So, as I've mentioned, one of the main themes of both the Iliad and the Odyssey is the acceptance of mortality as an essential aspect of the human condition. And I think one of the ways this can be summed up is in Glaucus' defiant words to Diomedes in the Iliad. So this is in the 6th book of the Iliad, and Glaucus and Diomedes are exchanging challenges. Glaucus says, "Like the generations of leaves, the lives of mortal men. Now the wind scatters the old leaves across the earth. Now the living timber bursts with the new buds, and spring comes round again. And so with men, as one generation comes to life, another dies away." So as I've mentioned, the existence of the gods as deathless provides a contrast that highlights this aspect of the human condition, that we are the dying ones, that we will die, that we have a finite limit. When we first see Odysseus, he accepts this aspect of the human condition. He desires to return home and to fulfill his humanity and selfhood. So now let's turn to book 6 to 8, where we see Odysseus among the Phaeacians. So at the end of book 5, with Calypso's help, Odysseus builds a raft and leaves her island. However, Poseidon wrecks his raft at sea. Odysseus washes up on the shore of the island Scheria. He's naked, he's battered, starved, he's almost dead. He falls asleep in a pile of leaves by the bank of a river, and that's how book 5 ends. Upon waking, he utters the lines that are repeated when he arrives on the land of the Cyclopes. That's the plural of Cyclops, Cyclopes. And when he returns, he also repeats these lines when he returns to Ithaca in book 13. So these lines, man of misery, whose land have I lit on now? What are they here? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men? So here, these lines underscore again that theme of xenia that we talked about in the last lecture, where civility versus barbarity is defined by how one deals with strangers. When he first utters these lines on the island of Scheria, this is the island of the Phaeacians, he's going to meet great xenia. The Phaeacians are incredible hosts and very gracious to strangers. The next time he utters these lines on the island of Polyphemus the Cyclops, it's the exact opposite, the polar aberration of xenia. Rather than feeding the guest, he tries to eat the guests as his own meal. And then on the island of Ithaca, the final utterance of these lines, we have a strange mixture of the two. It's his home. It shouldn't be a strange land, and he's received well by Eumaeus and at there, but he also needs to be wary because the suitors who are the real guests there are trying to kill him. So the Phaeacians are dedicated to xenia. They provide ships to stranded travelers. The first figure he meets there is Nausicaa, and Athena inspires Nausicaa to go down to the river where Odysseus is sleeping in order to do her laundry. And Odysseus is bathed there. And Athena beautifies him afterwards. And Nausicaa comments to her maidens that she would be happy to marry him if he would stay on Scheria. And this is one of, let's say, a number of dangerous females that Odysseus encounters. Now, Nausicaa is not dangerous in the sense that she wants to harm Odysseus. Calypso, in a way, is harming Odysseus, holding him against his will. Circe, the same, we'll see later, was harmful to Odysseus's crew, especially initially. Nausicaa is not that far from it. She wants to help. Her and the Phaeacians end up helping Odysseus. However, there's a temptation or the possibility of staying here with Nausicaa, as there was with Circe and Calypso, rather than return home and rather than fulfill the final goal that Odysseus has. So the Phaeacians make a point of providing xenia to any shipwrecked travelers, and Odysseus is entertained royally with athletic games and with a bard's songs. The athletic games show Odysseus in his aspect of warrior as he was in the Iliad. So because the athletic games here in the Iliad, in the Aeneid, are really, in effect, practice for battle. So when one of the Phaeacians says that Odysseus does not look like an athlete, he's basically saying, you're no warrior. And Odysseus gets up and throws the discus further than anyone had, and reveals, of course, he's not only a greater athlete than them, but a great warrior as well. We then see the songs of the bard Demodocus, and some of these songs reiterate some of the crucial themes of the Trojan War story. So the first song tells of a quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, which honors Odysseus. The second song recounts a love affair of Ares and Aphrodite. And then the third song is at the request of Odysseus, and it tells of the story of the Trojan horse, devised by Odysseus to gain entry into the walls of Troy. When Demodocus sings of the Trojan horse, Odysseus weeps. So the bard, and at this point, the bard uses one of the most memorable similes. The bard, Homer, uses one of the most memorable similes in the Odyssey to describe Odysseus's weeping. So Odysseus had been hearing this story of the Trojan War and the Trojan horse. And as he's hearing this story, he's weeping. And then in recounting this, the bard says, "That was the song the famous harper sang, but great Odysseus melted into tears, running down from his eyes to wet his cheeks. As a woman weeps, her arms flung round her darling husband, a man who fell in battle, fighting for town and townsmen, trying to beat the day of doom from home and children. Seeing the man go down, dying, gasping for breath, she clings for dear life, screams and shrills, but the victors just behind her, digging spear butts into her back and shoulders, drag her off in bondage. Yoked to hard labor, pain, and the most heartbreaking torment wastes her cheeks. So from Odysseus's eyes ran tears of heartbreak now." So as he hears the story of the Trojan horse and how it led to the great victory of the Greeks over the Trojans and the sacking of that city, he weeps. He weeps, as do women of a sacked city. So we, through this simile, we're able to see the Trojan War story from both sides, both the side of the victor as well as that of those who suffered the waste of their city, the destruction, the slaying of their loved ones. And there can be no other sacking of any city we would have first in or top of mind than the sacking of Troy, since we had just been talking about that, since we had just heard that story of the sacking of Troy from the bard Demodocus. So a brilliant comparison there through the epic simile provided by Homer. I just want to make another note about the epic similes in the Odyssey. So I think it's interesting in that one of I would say both the Iliad and the Odyssey, some of the most powerful passages in the works come in the form of these amazing similes that Homer provides, that they become a staple of the epic conventions copied by Virgil, by Milton, who did them, who tried to build on Homer, each in their own way. Interestingly, in the Iliad, we get about 187 of those. And in the Odyssey, we get far fewer. We get only 41. These were tabulated by Ian Johnson, and there's a link to his website. So that's some great labor there, going through the text meticulously. Interestingly, there's almost no epic similes in the Telemachy section, first 4 books, only 2 in book 4. So it seems to show that the truly great epic events, which can only be described in comparison with other phenomena, occur when Odysseus enters the story. So he's our true hero, and I'll have to use epic similes. I'll have to use these types of grand comparisons in order to bring forth the grandeur of his exploits. So Demodocus' song proves to Odysseus that his deeds have not been forgotten, that he has earned kleos. It's the question we can ask ourselves. So as I said, it's a great simile. Odysseus' tears are compared to the tears of a woman of Troy who's crying at the death of her husband after the Greeks are sacking the city. However, I don't think that's why Odysseus is crying. We could ask ourselves, why is he crying? I often ask my class, why is Odysseus crying? And inevitably we're led to the conclusion, well, he's crying because it seems that his he's been reassured that his fame, his kleos, lives on beyond him. So his tears of joy, so to speak, the fact that um, after all these years, after 10 years of his journeys, he knows that his fame, his story has lived on, that people haven't forgotten about his exploits in Troy and his genius in coming up with the Trojan horse. So this song also leads to the revelation of Odysseus's identity, as Alcinous is the king of the Phaeacians. He asks why he is weeping. Odysseus um, reveals to Alcinous and the Phaeacians his true identity. He had held his identity in reserve because he's cautious. Again, and we'll see this a number of times. He's cautious, he's prudent. He doesn't know if if giving away his identity could lead to danger. Here he knows that he's been given ample proof that they are great hosts, that they are going to be civilized, that they're going to provide him shelter, that they will help him on his way. So he he does reveal his identity when asked by Alcinous why he's weeping. And at that point, he's asked to present his story. So it's in the next books 9 to 12, that Odysseus tells his story of the great wanderings since he left Troy after it fell. And as I mentioned in the first lecture, this is probably the most famous part of the Odyssey, where we see him encounter monsters. We see him with Circe, with Polyphemus the Cyclops, and it's to that portion of the Odyssey that we will return in the next lecture. Thank you.